Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to convene this conversation, Fugitive Paperwork, Documentary Practices in Literature, Art and History, with Carlos Soto Román joining from Santiago, Wakin Segura joining from Mexico City, Michael Leong joining from Los Angeles, and Livia Rezende and me, who are both joining from Sydney. My name is Astrid Lorange, and I'm a senior lecturer in art theory here at UNSW Art and Design. I'm a member of the Media Futures Hub, the research network, who is graciously hosting this event today. A live stream, ending to the stream in the other room as I wrangle Zoom. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the Wongal people of the Eora Nation, on whose unceded country I am Zooming from. I acknowledge the unbroken sovereignty that carries this country and further acknowledge the illegitimacy of the Australian nation state. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Today's event reckons with the nation state as a particular kind of institution, as well as with the many histories and practices of settler colonialism that link and differentiate us across what are now called Australia, Chile, Mexico, the USA, and Brazil, where Livia is from and where her research is primarily situated. And so I also acknowledge, in addition, the sovereign lands that connect us here today in this mediated space of conversation, and pay my respects to Indigenous struggles across the world. Now, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd like to give a brief and intimate history of this panel and how it came to be. 10 years ago, I happened to live in Philadelphia at the same time as Carlos Soto Román, both of us choosing the city as our temporary home in order to study poetry. In 2013, after I'd returned to Sydney, Carlos published Chile Project, Reclassified, with Gauss PDF, an online publisher of contemporary poetry, art, and media. Chile Project comprises a single 45-page PDF document that collates selected pages from the CIA's internal archive on Chile, declassified by the Clinton administration from 1999 onwards. The 45 pages, a combination of handwritten, typewritten, and telegraphic documents, noisy from multiple photocopies and internal notation systems, was still significantly redacted despite their putative declassification, were then further edited by Carlos, who reclassified the documents by whiting out text with correction fluid, save for a few keywords and phrases. Apologies, there's a whippersnipper at work right next to me. This piece became something of an obsession of mine. Years later, in early pregnancy and horrifically nauseated, I visited Gertrude Contemporary in Melbourne to see a show, Repertoires of Contention, featuring work by the Mexico City-based artist Wakin Segura and the local artist Tony Garifalakis. The show was curated by Ivan Munoz Reed and attempted to bring those two artists into conversation around shared preoccupations with power, violence, ideology, and social formations. I was too sick to stay in the gallery for more than a moment, but I was there for long enough to develop another obsession, this time with Wakin's enormous renderings of redacted state intelligence documents in tapestry. Later, I realized that the document remediated by Wakin was from the very same archive that Carlos had intervened in, a moment of convergence and coincidence that confirmed to me the trajectory of my current research project. Since that day in Melbourne, I have followed Wakin's work and have found across his incredible projects a shared goal of engaging with, as he calls it, the poetics of conflict and resistance that accompany the colonial world-making project and its manifold miseries, and the many histories of struggle that accompany it and exceed it. Last year, when I finally finished writing a paper on Carlos's Chile project, I wrote to him. He mentioned that Michael Leong at Cal Arts had just published a book on the turn to documents in contemporary poetry and had used an image from the project for the cover. I immediately ordered Michael's book, Contested Records, which is an incredible literary, critical, and cultural theoretical project that articulates a much needed account of how and why contemporary poetry's engagement with the document as a social object and contested site is necessary for our understandings of history, power, and memory. But I am missing a step. Before I finished the paper on Carlos, I presented a draft of to my colleagues at a work in progress session. My wonderful colleague, Livia Rezende, messaged me afterwards and said, "We need to talk." Our research, it turned out, is resonant. Livia sent me her paper, Deep Encounters with the Design History Archives from Brazil 68 to now, a rich account of the absolute ambivalence of the archive. In it, Livia recalls entering the archive of the Superior School of Industrial Design, impelled by a photograph from 1968, and immediately facing both chaos and fragility as she apprehended the material of history alongside the precarity of the present moment. And so a couple of months ago, I decided to convene this conversation between these four people whose work came to me through networks of friends, community, solidarity, and chance in order to talk about documentary practices in contemporary art, literature, and history. In particular, I wanted to stage a conversation about how we might forge critical practices of reading history against the grain, to use Saidiya Hartman's phrase, in order to better understand and resist operations of state power. The argument that I am developing in my own research project is that to work with the document is to work with the history and force of bureaucracy and its administration of violence. And to work with the document is to work primarily with the production of specific reading publics and counterpublics whose attunement to the poetics of governance and to the historically contingent foundations on which paper infrastructures of statecraft are built can reorient readerly attention to the material operations of power and therefore to the potential sites in which struggles over power arise. In other words, documentary practices can help us to read history with the attention we grant a poem. To read history in this way is to plan for a future that exceeds the nation state and its monopoly on violence. So by way of concluding this introduction, I want to consider in more detail what it is we are talking about today. What is a document? In her media history of paperwork, Lisa Gittelman spends the introduction on this very question. A document, in her reading, is an epistemic object which has been processed in some way by devices of framing, organizing, classifying, situating. The production and reproduction of documents is central to how we come to understand what is knowable and showable. And documents are central to how power is organized, how people are managed. In this sense, the history of the document is also a history of statehood, bureaucracy, and discipline, a history in which the complexity of life is reduced to the ledger, spreadsheet, database. Many scholars have offered invaluable critical insight into the relationship between documents and violence. Caitlin Rosenthal looks at how plantation logics underwrites management and accounting practices. And Laura Stoller looks at how individual actors and contingent moments lead to the anxiety of the colonial archive and the ever-changing conditions of maintaining and legitimating occupation. Gittelman shows how different documents, for example, the Xerox, can be read for their contributions to the practices of statecraft. And many abolitionists offer in-depth accounts of how documents and the infinite labyrinth of paperwork that constitute the prison industrial complex often work in fatal ways. But there is another history to the document, a history of the leak, the whistleblow, the furtive copy, the forged note, the uncrackable code, and the documents that exceed capture and enclosure, documents that cannot be archived, archives that belong to the social field. So today, we're going to think about both kinds of documents, the knowledge and counter-knowledge that they suggest, and most importantly, the operation of the latter on the former. Hence the name of this session, Fugitive Paperwork. So I'll introduce the four speakers in order of appearance now, and then I will invite each of them to speak for around 10 minutes before heading into a broader discussion. If you have any questions at any point during the event, please submit them through the YouTube live stream comment box, and we'll have time in the discussion to answer them. So first up, we'll hear from Livia Rezende. Livia is a design historian living on Gadigal land and working at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. She is co-founder of Open, an art and design decolonial praxis collective. Her publications feature in Iberoamericana, Designing Worlds, Cultures of International Exhibitions, Design Frontiers, and the Journal of Design History, whose Locating Design Exchanges in Latin America and the Caribbean special issue Livia co-edited. Then we'll hear from Carlos Soto Román. Carlos, a poet and translator, is the author of 11, Chile Project Reclassified, Nature of Objects, and Common Sense. He is also the translator of Holocaust by Charles Reznikov into Spanish. Following Carlos, we'll have Michael Leong. Michael is the author of the monograph Contested Records, The Turn to Documents in Contemporary North American Poetry from the University of Iowa Press 2020, which I mentioned earlier and which I highly recommend, as well as several volumes of poetry, including most recently Words on Edge by Black Square Editions 2018. He teaches in the School of Critical Studies at the California Institute of the Arts and lives in Los Angeles. And Wakin Segura will be our final speaker today. Joaquín Segura is a visual artist based in Mexico City. His interdisciplinary artistic practice is centered around meditations on the phenomenology of history, power, and truth, as well as on an extended engagement with notions such as objecthood, socio-political microclimates, asymmetrical history, and ideology in the contemporary world. His work has been shown since the early 2000s in solo and group exhibitions in the Americas, Europe, Australia, and Asia. Segura is a founding member and board advisor of SOMA Mexico City and is currently working on his first artist monograph to be published by Cubo Blanco in Mexico in the fall of 2022. So thank you so much, everyone, again for joining us. Over to you, Livia.
I'm just getting my PowerPoint up. Can you first?
Então, Clara, por que você virou estudante há pouco tempo? Por que você foi fazer o doutorado? Bom, eu resolvi voltar a estudar porque eu imaginei que com a subida do Bolsonaro ao poder, estudar era a minha possibilidade principal de ler, pensar, formular, escrever e entender que estudar poderia ser uma atividade de resistência e de, quem sabe, ativismo nesse momento.
It is what it is. Archives are the way they are for a reason. At SG's archives, I feel cautious, respectful even, of moving and removing things from where they are. They are there for a reason, not for a purpose, but for a reason. It is August 2019, and the archive of the Superior School of Industrial Design, or Escola Superior de Desenho Industrial, also known as SG, is closed. In part because of the ongoing financial and political crisis in the Rio de Janeiro state, and the dismantling of public education and cultural institutions in Brazil. After a few messages and phone calls, I am granted a backdoor access to it. SG was inaugurated in 1963 as one of the first modern design schools in Latin America, and part of the industrializing endeavors to modernize the continent. I did my bachelor's in design at SG in the 1990s. 20 years later, I worked there as a research fellow. Asking to see the archives was akin to asking to come home. I entered the archives guided by a photograph from 1968 that I found in a book. 1968 was a momentous year in Brazilian history, when the military junta that had overthrown democracy in 1964 affected the closure of the National Congress and the state legislative assemblies. In 1968, the militaries institutionalized torture, censorship, and CIA-backed state terror campaigns against dissidents who were mostly students. The balance of 20 years of violent dictatorship and democratic repression in Brazil has not been paid yet. Hundreds were exiled, tortured, and killed, mostly unnamed. A recent inquiry, the only one of its kind, recognized the death of just a few more than 400 people by the brutal hands of the state. However, unlike any other Latin American countries, Brazil did not trial its torturers, its generals and captains. In fact, one of them is Jair Bolsonaro, who was elected Brazil's president in 2019. At SG's archives, I don't feel anger or frustration. I am eager to see beyond what is not right, correct, or normative, where others would only see mess. I am grateful for not spotting cockroaches. I find lots of termites in that debris, but not cockroaches. I can work here. On my second day at SG's archive, a woman, one of the school cleaners, is lying on a cardboard on the floor. As with several thousand Brazilian workers, she probably leaves home before dawn and endures a dilapidated public transport network to get to work. Archive or deposit or quiet room. This is a multi-purpose site. I try not to disturb her, switch off the lights, and proceed to the cubicle at the far end, where the filing cabinets and hundreds of toilet paper rolls reside. Here is a term I've created to name and know this archive: acquisition process aesthetics. The hundreds of toilet paper rolls, fluorescent bulbs, and sodium hypochlorite bottles, who will be my companion this week, result from government acquisition processes, from bulk buying and stocking up in times of crisis. I enter the archive as I am looking for clues on this exhibit, which I've named the Vacuum Room. This was a protest staged by design students unexpectedly at the SG Pavilion during the first International Design Biennial, held at the Modernist Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro in 1968. The Vacuum Room laughed at the otherwise serious intent of the biennial of inserting Brazil in the global circuit of exhibitions, an effort, according to Gardner and Green, quote, very much in the Cold War shadow of the United States intervention in South America and its conflicted sponsorship of brutal, authoritarian military regimes, end quote. Sodium hypochlorite is a chlorine compound often used as a disinfectant. It is bleach. The smell of bleach is strong today. One of the very few publications on this period stated that a student from SG called Maria Valderez may have been one of the makers behind these protests at the biennial. Alongside others, Maria Valderez was brutally arrested by the state during a student conference in 1968. Hers are the words that have been guiding my research. Quote, the SD Pavilion discussed what was designed in Brazil and for Brazil. We wanted, among other things, that the college turned itself to the Brazilian reality, end quote. On my last day at the archive, I am approached by a staff member from the school's cleaning company. Her not real name is Anna. She wants to hear my opinion on the removal of the filing cabinets the following week. I was caught by surprise. Is the archive being moved? She looked worried. She had seen my hands covered in plastic gloves handling paperwork and assumed I was an archivist. She tells me that due to a staff shortage, they were planning to empty the drawers of all filing cabinets before moving them around. Each drawer corresponds to 1 year of institutional documentary evidence, kept organized despite their disheartening surroundings. I want to preserve the archival integrity of each drawer. I replied to her saying they should remove the documents drawer by drawer instead. At least that, I panic. I start envisioning files scattered on the floor, fragile documents ripped, items sent free from previous archival logic, never to meet each other again. To whom should I turn my panic? I sense a class-driven fear creeping up. I check in with myself. I am suspicious of the subcontracted staff abilities to do this job. Who's responsible for this state of affairs after all? I want to interfere, me and my plastic gloved hands. After meeting Anna, I emailed the school director on my phone, my furious typing betraying a forced politeness. The environmental institutional chaos gets the best of me. I fret with the recurrent thinking that all order will be lost. All life and mental processes manifested in the making of this archive will be lost due to the simplest of the facts, that all is chaos around here. Yet I fully understand the inevitability of my circumstances and the broader forces that rule them. Since stepping in here, I've been treating this archive as the historical folding of 1968 into the present. The bleach stinks as the epistemicides committed then and now. Anne Stoller's words resonate loud. Like her, I see this archive as, quote, condensed sites of epistemological and political anxiety, rather than as skewed and biased sources, quote. The dismantling of these structures, public education, cultural institutions, archives, results from the fear that federal and state governments, then and now, few of their most dangerous opponents, students like Maria Valderez in 1968 or Clara in 2019. Like Stoller, I want to interrogate structures to understand structural and systemic discrimination, racism, suppression, and oppression. Like Stoller, I see this archive in its destitution as an, quote, intricate technology of rule, end quote, in itself. Everything in this archive is evidence, it is pulsing. Even if, ironically, the hanging file folders end up scattered on the floor, reconfigured in an order never envisioned. A few minutes after receiving my email, the school director comes to see me at the archive deposit quiet room. She reassures me that no more resources can be deployed. The director can only count on a handful of subcontracted maintenance staff for the removal job, which consists of carrying the filing cabinets down the precarious stairs. We spend what feels like a long time discussing the intricacies of removing and repositioning each set of hanging folders as to preserve what is, for me, the sanctified archival integrity. Not enough personnel, this will have to be done little by little. One cabinet a day, maybe? I keep fearing the fresh rosters of subcontracted staff not privy to our conversation may act on their own accord, devising on the spot well-intended ad hoc removal methods. Ad hoc is a difficult term to grapple with, and when thinking, writing, and acting in the colonial terms. On the one hand, we want to side with those before us who hailed ad hocism as a creative rebellious insurgence against the order, rules, planning, powers, and hierarchies of modernism and coloniality. Ad hoc, in its most favorable acceptation, trumps the impossibility of transcending the so-called conditions of underdevelopment with the use of imagination and improvisation and the energy that arises from immanence. On the other hand, ad hocism also means improvisation in moving archives, in keeping or not with their integrity, according to the vagaries of the moment. This archival encounter then poses me a question that has been a lifelong interrogation. On what side do I sit at the ad hoc celebration camp when my lived experience inside and outside academia have been shaken by troubled and troubling ad hocism and precariousness? In her beautiful prose, Saidiya Hartman suggests that historians should strain against the limits of the archive. Her own deep encounters include working with, quote, scraps of the archive with unknown persons, nameless figures, ensembles, collectives, multitude, the chorus, end quote. As I leave the archives to return to Australia to write about these design biennials, the design student protests their fight against imperialism and pro-reality. I leave the archive, but the archive does not leave me. Like Hartman, I recognize that historical epistemic violence against indigenous and enslaved African peoples, quote, resides precisely in all the stories that we cannot know and that will never be recovered, end quote. As I return to Australia, I leave the archive, but the archive does not leave me. I now carry those unknown persons, nameless figures, ensembles, collectives, multitudes. I carry those silences and those silenced as a constitutive impossibility that needs to be rewritten into our histories unless we become complicit with that historical violence. How to gaze into the abyss and not be afraid of it gazing back at you. How to fight monsters and not become one in the process. In my own fabrication, I see bell hooks winking to Nietzsche, her positional gaze joyfully saying that it is now time that we engage with our colonial monsters.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carlos Soto Román, and I'd like to talk a little bit about Chile project. And to do that, I think I'm going to share a little bit of a video we made along with the artists Barbara Oettinger and Camila Estrella to be presented at the Erase Festival, organized recently by the University of Bergen in Norway. So I'm going to show a little bit of that video, and then I'll talk a little bit about that project.
Borradura. Erasure. Los labios se juntan solo para expandirse. The lips melt. La lengua ronronea, repta, se arrastra por el paladar. The rolling R's. Las comisuras se arquean. The hole. Un pequeño chiflón de aire encalla en la quijada. A gust of wind sinks. Luego todo se libera. Nothingness. El fin ocurre en el principio. The end. El fin al fin. Finally, the finale. Borradura, raspadura, borrón, tachadura, erasure. A magician makes a curious gesture with his hands. What it used to be there, fate. The subject matter of that swindler is an illusion, but illusionism is an art that heavily relies on certain angles of the light. Un vil truco, an image that is innocently sustained in the imagination, la nación de las imágenes. Will render no other than disappointment. Ma, he, na. The result of the disappearance, the gesture, the act. Gone. Interrogar los documentos que describen la violencia. Interrogate. How. Remediar el contenido de los archivos. Remediate. When. Representar el rechazo a aceptar el tránsito. Antagonizing. De la crueldad al secreto. Del secreto a la urna, de la urna al archivo. Otra vez. And again, and again. Dejar de ser testigo, refrain. Apropiarse más bien de la intención, a dream. De atestiguar lo que los documentos proscriben, forbid. Un trazo grueso y tosco, aparentemente inseguro. The desert. Desaparece una a una las palabras vacías. The veil. Al tiempo que enfatiza la más profunda oscuridad. The void. Primer parpadeo. First blinking. ¿Cómo comprometer los documentos del sufrimiento sin convertirse uno mismo en un documento del sufrimiento? Compromise, commitment. ¿Por qué nuestros documentos deben ser coherentes si es precisamente el orden lo que queremos subvertir? The order. To go through the desert. To roam. To find a message. A sign. To find something. Encontrar un lenguaje que posibilite nombrar las grietas de la precariedad de nuestro corazón de las tinieblas. The homeland. Una materialidad que cruce la topografía del libro and the architecture, the archive textures of the heart. Silencio. Equivalencia, a note. Identity, un rumor. Legibilidad, a statement. Reality, el horror.
The homeland.
Okay, so I'm just gonna stop there, and I'll share another video, this time without sound, while I'm talking a little bit about this project. Bear with me a second. Okay. So this is Chile project, the erasure project that Astrid was talking about at the beginning, and this project started while I was living in Philadelphia around the year 2010, 2011. I was living there and like studying bioethics, but also very committed to the poetry scene there. And I wanted to write something about Chile, particularly because the 40th anniversary, the 40th commemoration of the coup d'etat was coming, and it was a very significant date, and I was away from home, and all of a sudden all these images and remembrances came, you know, like flooded media and news feeds, and it felt like something, like almost like a duty, you know, to respond to this, particularly living in the state, a country that in a way sponsored this violent and horrific coup. And I wanted to write about this event, but in a different way. And I was trying to find what could be a proper way to tell about these events in a way that didn't that it was true, but didn't risk, you know, I guess, you know, like the memory of and the horror that and the atrocities that were inflicted on a large population. So I began doing some research and came across this the Chile project, you know, this set of documents, the classified documents from the CIA that the Clinton administration decided to make public. And so I consulted the National Security Archive, which was a repository that hosted most of these documents. And what caught my attention at the very beginning was the state of these documents, the state that some describe as the violence of the archive. And it was particularly the fact that the information there was severely redacted. And the piece of information that was actually legible, it was already known, or it was so affected by the original redaction that it was kind of impossible to make sense of it. So that was, in a way, very ironic. And I decided to intervene those documents to try to evidence that irony, and also to make more evident the violence of the document that also I thought reflected the violence inflicted in actual persons, in actual people. So I decided to erase, using like white up liquid paper and all those materials, to erase all the words that had not been redacted by the CIA. And the result is the pages that you are seeing right now. And I think it created a very interesting way to see and to read, even though there's not much to read on these pages. But well, obviously we can talk about this later on, but I think it gives a different perspective to visualize and to testify the violence of the archive, and also the disappearing of people. That was also kind of like a systematic practice exerted by the regime during many years. So I think this is was one way to respond to that violence, and to also bring back a certain kind of horror and provide a different reflection on the document and on the events that occurred during that time.
Hi, I'm Michael Leong. I'm such a big fan of Carlos's work, so it's truly an honor to follow him. And I actually have some reflections on Carlos's work. The title of my presentation is Carlos Soto Román's Pharmacy, or Remediation's Remedy. The first part of my title makes a nod to Jacques Derrida's Plato's Pharmacy, which many Anglophone readers know from Barbara Johnson's 1981 translation of Dissemination. The second part of my title remediates, as it were, the core concept of J. David Bolter and Richard Grusin's Remediation, Understanding New Media, an influential work of media studies from 1999. My goal here is to begin remediating an assumption in my recent book, Contested Records, to turn to documents in contemporary North American poetry, which analyzes Carlos's brilliant erasure poem, Chile Project, Reclassified. Published electronically in 2013 by the Oakland-based Gauss PDF, and in a somber print edition in 2016 by Santiago-based Pez Espiral, Chile Project is an appropriation of documents from the US Secret Archive about political terrorism and human rights abuses in Chile during Pinochet's dictatorship. The conceptual elegance of the project is that Carlos subjects already redacted documents to further redaction, making the forced disappearance of political dissidents more palpably visible. In Contested Records, which displays remediated images from Chile Project on its front cover, I characterized Chile Project in the following ways. In an act of critical mimicry, some of Soto Román's reclassificatory erasures are nearly indistinguishable from documents sanitized and declassified by the government. Soto Román's erasures are critical palimpsests that, in solidarity with the disappeared, turn state censorship back on itself. One of the major claims of Contested Records is that documentalist poets cite mostly publicly available text in order to return them rhetorically transformed to the public sphere, an aspect frequently overlooked in studies about textual appropriation, such as Marjorie Perloff's Unoriginal Genius and Kenneth Goldsmith's Uncreative Writing. An assumption behind my book is that documental poetics, that is, a poetics based on pre-existing documentation, from news reports to testimonies to governmental records, is essentially homeopathic in its engagement with what Walter Benjamin calls documents of barbarism. And on the concept of history, Benjamin memorably states, "There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism." And just as such a document is not free of barbarism, barbarism taints also the manner in which it was transmitted from one owner to another, end quote. If all cultural objects and documents and their routes of circulation are contaminated by the violence of the civitas, the wager of documental poetics is that documentation as a kind of Derridian pharmacon can be both poisonous and curative. In other words, documental poetics fights documents with documents in a discursive struggle of competing documentalities, undocumentalities, and monumentalities. Every state document of repression suggests a counter-document, just as every hegemonic mode of documentary transmission suggests fugitive pathways of counter-circulation. Viewing Carlos's recent video poem, Boradora, has suggested to me a non-archival, which is to say performative method of confronting the malady of archive fever, a method that I'll call allopathic. Boradora premiered in September 2021 during Erase, a digital festival and conference on the poetics and politics of erasure. The video in part remediates Chile Project, showing us at times shots of the hyper-redacted documents that were part of Operation Condor's bureaucratic machinery. According to J. David Bolter and Richard Grusin, remediation indicates the representation of one medium in another, or a borrowing in which one medium is itself incorporated or represented in another medium. In Boradora, the old medium of print is represented in the new medium of digital film. In Bolter and Grusin's parlance, Boradora is both hypermediated and immediate. The film includes a heterogeneous mix of music and voiceover alongside visual frames of varying scales. At the same time, Boradora offers the immediacy of process as we see the maker's hand alter various texts with an impressive range of implements, from stylus pen to erasure to black electrical tape. The latter gesture is a particularly powerful one if we consider the tape as an insulating and protective material in the context of the many electrocutions that took place during Pinochet's necropolitical regime. According to Bolter and Grusin, the word remediation derives ultimately from the Latin remedere, to heal, to restore to health. We have adopted the word to express the way in which one medium is seen by our culture as reforming or improving upon another, end quote. For all its explanatory power in making sense of a complex ecology of modern and contemporary media, Bolter and Grusin's remediation is overly tied to Harold Bloom's famous notion of an anxiety of influence. Remediation's picture of various media forms vying and competing for relevance in an agonistic struggle. Film one-ups photography in the same way that John Ashbery one-ups Wallace Stevens is perhaps too self-reflexive to illuminate works such as Boradora that aspire to nothing less than the remediation of historical trauma. Bloom, for his part, is also problematically tied to metaphors of disease that are in fact widespread in 20th century thought, from Derrida's concept of archive fever to Marxist traditions of symptomatic reading. According to Bloom, quote, influence is influenza, an astral disease. If influence were health, who would write a poem, end quote. You might say that working with historical and literary texts under the sign of Benjamin, Bloom, Derrida, and others is tantamount to practicing a kind of pathology or epidemiology. Quote, just as a document of civilization is not free of barbarism, barbarism taints also the manner in which it was transmitted from one owner to another, end quote. I use the term remediation as a kind of conceptual pun that explicitly bridges discourses of media studies and medicine to account for figures and tropes of healing in a range of contemporary poems, Boradora included, that draw on documents in order to reckon with the traumas of colonial and post-colonial violence. When facing barbaric documents contaminated by state violence, we need an epidemiology, to be sure, but we also need a prescription. And who better to provide us with a prescriptive remedy than pharmacist, poet, and translator Carlos Soto Román. In one of the most astounding gestures of Boradora, Carlos applies a pharmaceutical powder onto the documents, treating them, as it were, with an allopathic cure in an effort to remediate and remedy the trauma of the dictatorship. At times, the powder is reminiscent of the sands of the Atacama Desert, suggesting a kind of ritualistic burial, a laying of the text to rest. For purposes of this presentation, I want to focus on two different definitions of the verb to doctor, which can mean to disguise, falsify, or tamper with, as well as to administer medicine or medical treatment to, and those are from the OED. Coming from the Latin verb docere, to teach, Doctor is in fact etymologically linked to the word document. There is surely one form of doctoring in Carlos's poetic practice, the tampering with state documents by means of deletion. This resistance to erasure through erasure, a whiting out to confront the white terror of fascism, is what I've been calling a homeopathic response. Boradora gives us another kind of doctoring, a remediating remedy, courtesy of Carlos Soto Román's pharmacy. In documentality, why it is necessary to leave traces, Maurizio Ferraris theorizes a social ontology in which documents are, quote, the highest form of social objects. There are, according to Ferraris, strong documents, such as passports, treaties, and governmental constitutions, which are inscriptions of performative acts backed by institutional power, as well as weak documents, such as receipts, diaries, and poems, which merely record information. In Ferraris's necessarily limited social ontology, Boradora might be considered a weak document. Nevertheless, according to my remediated concept of remediation, it constitutes strong medicine. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Joaquín Segura. I would like to start by acknowledging this amazing and diverse group that has gathered today per invitation of Astrid. I'm very grateful for this and for the opportunity to engage into this stimulating exchange. I don't really have much to add to Astrid's incredibly generous introduction, so I will share my screen. I put together a selection of recent work of the past several years. While my work does operate and articulates within the realm of visual arts, I'm convinced that this is a critical moment to work towards a wider understanding of the nuances, breakpoints and subtleties of capital notions such as history, power, and truth, as our current socio-political context keeps exposing the frailty of what was once supposed to monolithically underpin and sustain our larger circumstance. I will briefly address a series of free-ranging notions that have informed my creative practice through this selection of images of projects that have proved relevant to me in the past several years. This is exercises of selective mutism, a project I started in 2011 in Mexico City. Dozens of banners used by an assortment of individuals and collectives in political rallies and protest sites were collected and erased using white latex paint and were later arranged as sculptural objects in the walls of the exhibition space. Its content was completely nullified by this action, and only traces of it remains. The voice of each banner gave to this body is now completely illegible. The text on the banners is only now accessible through the title of each individual work, and they refer mostly to political unrest and social violence, mostly in Mexico City, where is the site where most of these banners were collected. In my creative practice, I consider the archive is everywhere. That is one of the precepts that has guided my creative output almost obsessively for the better part of the past couple decades. One of my most pressing objectives is to develop non-traditional and non-linear ways of reading this heterogeneity, whether that is a 1974 poem written by a South Korean military dictator mourning his wife, assassinated in an attempt of his own life, or an 1822 book written by an American envoy in Mexican soil, or an installation composed by the accumulation of materials needed to incinerate a human body in an open field setting, which is the case of this 2016 work titled Pyre, which stems from the 2014 state-sanctioned massacre in which the Mexican army disappeared 43 students in a case that has remained unsolved ever since. Or whether is it live ammunition sourced from the military, or from the police, or from the black market, depending on the context on which these works are executed. And this ammunition is later repurposed as drone utensils for wall interventions, such as this series of works, which started in 2016, and in which are now dozens of individual works. The series is called The War of All Against All, in a nod to Hobbes and Leviathan. This is the exhibition space of how one of these works looks like when it's installed, or whether it's direct work with declassified documents, just as this triptych, which is titled December 22nd, 1997, Red Mask, and which is an abstract composition based on released intelligence briefs related to the actual massacre, another state-sanctioned mass murder in Mexico, in which 45 indigenous women, children, and men were assassinated by a paramilitary group in the southern state of Chiapas in Mexico. As several of you may be aware, in Mexico, bloodshed and institutionalized violence are both national sports that we excel in. I am very much interested in absence, silence, and loss. This is, for example, 2019 hot list tapestry, Gobelin, which is part of a series that I started back in 2012. The series is called Blackouts and Whitewashes, and they are textile renderings of declassified documents, mostly dealing with torture techniques, in what the US calls as enhanced interrogation techniques. This specifically has to do with a document related to the Orlando Letelier assassination in Washington in 1976, 3 years after the Pinochet coup d'etat, which Carlos mentioned a few minutes ago. I am very much interested in how the document, or an expanded understanding of the document, plays onto how ideology is projected and sustained. I am interested in propaganda, as these 2015 series of tapestry works as well, which are named Ideological Clearances, which are, again, textile renditions of mostly socialist propaganda, which I work with. I am very interested in the physical, in the materiality of ideas, and I believe you can actually evaluate the significance of an idea by the state its vessels currently have now. So this series has to do with this idea. I was attempting to gauge an abstract index of the economic value of ideology apparatuses nowadays. So basically, in this series of tapestries, what I did was work with a renowned tapestry workshop located in Guadalajara, Mexico, called Taller Mexicano de Gobelinos, which is 50-year-old workshop founded by Austrian textile artist Fritz Riedel, who relocated to Mexico back then and is now operated by the Ashida family, which is a very prominent family of patrons and gallerists and curators in Mexico. And so I worked in collaboration with them to reproduce these images from my archive, in which these images, actually, these books from where the textiles were woven are in my personal archive. These are some of these ideas, I think, clearly reflect on this new series of paintings that I have been working on for the past couple of years. These are paintings that have to do with propaganda materials as well, in which all textual content has been removed, and I only focus on a hyper-realist rendering of the traces that time has left on these propaganda materials. This, for example, is Wage, Labor, and Capital, which is a 2020 painting. It's based on a 1960-something edition of the homonymous Marxist pamphlet. It was edited by Editorial Cartago, which was the editorial imprint of the Argentinian Communist Party, and played a major role in socializing the socialist literature in South America. This is On Contradiction. It's based on a 1964 Maoist pamphlet. And as you can see, I am mostly interested in these modernist compositions, and on the traces and on the damage each of these individual pamphlets reflect up to now. This is the latest painting, which was finished just a few weeks ago. This is called Defeat and Contradiction, would be the closest translation. It's actually a reproduction of an anti-Castro propaganda pamphlet edited in Mexico. This is another painting series that has to do with the ideas I have briefly been musing about in the past few minutes. This is called Empirism and Dogma. This series was started approximately in 2019. It's watercolor and acrylic interventions on identical Maoist pamphlets, which are identical pamphlets that were on practice, if I remember well, which is, as you very well know, is one of the theses in Mao's Red Book, which was published before as the fourth thesis. Before being the Red Book, you have 5 theses in the Red Book. These are also, and these connect to another part of my archival interests. I keep a personal archive in which somehow functions as a matrix of my visual work. An important part of this archive, I have been collecting improvised projectiles used by civilians in clashes against the riot police, mostly in Mexico, but I've been doing this labor in other contexts as well. So these are all images from that archive. These rocks were all collected in diverse scenarios of conflict all over the world, and then they were later painted directly into these pamphlets, which they're rather small. They're probably, I don't know, perhaps 12 centimeters per 7, something like that. And to wrap things up, to wrap my intervention up, I will briefly talk about a few projects that I have been recently working on. in the past few weeks. So I have been very interested in gestures and markings and scribblings. So I have been obsessively putting together an archive on those small marks for the past several years, and I am only starting to explore pathways onto how they will integrate into the rest of my visual work. This is a mural, a text mural called Untitled Tensions and Social Breakages. This is 2021 work, which was finished just last month, maybe, while I was in residency at Bemis Center in Omaha, Nebraska. I changed the scale of random underline I found in a secondhand book. This is part of that same exploration. This is called To Our Grandchildren. This is a scribbling found on a 1984 copy of Richard M. Nixon's The Real War, which is 1980, which is a book that was published by Nixon in 1980, and it has, of course, it connects to the Ideological Clearances tapestry series as well. I am also obsessed in the economic value of documents and ideas. And this is the last work I will be presenting today. This is called December 21st, 2012. And it's a site-specific installation, which is based on a communique that was sent out by the Zapatista army when Enrique Peña Nieto, which was the Mexican president that took office that year and who was highly controversial. I mean, it's a long story, but basically, he embodied corruption, abuse, and violence. And the Zapatista army replied with 4 lines, maybe 5 or 6, 4 or 5 lines, if I remember well. So that communique basically just bluntly stated, can you hear? This is the world. This is the sound of your world collapsing, which is what you can see on the plaque that forms this site-specific installation. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of the presenters. That was so fantastic, so wonderful to hear from all of you and to hear from all of those projects, and also to feel those resonances and to feel those overlaps. It's just so fantastic. So I recommend to anyone watching, please pop a question in the YouTube comment box. If you have something to ask either one or many of the presenters. In the meantime, and while you're gathering your thoughts, I have some questions that I'd like to open the discussion with. I prepared some questions in advance of the event, some of which I feel like has been really richly addressed throughout the presentations. And so I'm going to go to one of the questions that I'm sort of particularly interested in at the moment. So I'm going to selfishly ask something that I'm sort of mulling over in my work a lot at the moment, and that's about the state itself. So I'm going to ask this question, and then I might ask Joaquin, you to take it up first, because I think you kind of, in the presentation that you just finished the event with, then you sort of started to get to this specifically. So we often think of the state in the abstract, and often kind of as a kind of certain, if not monolithic entity, when in reality, of course, the state is a complex network of structures and processes and ideologies, and of course, actual people who live and die and who make important decisions, and who are often kind of working, to use Livia's term, in these kind of ad hoc fashions. So much work being done across the humanities and the arts at the moment really seeks to highlight the historical contingency of the state at a given moment in time and place, as well as to engage with specific practices and policies of statecraft in an effort to trace their emergence and operations in really kind of highly explicit contexts. And I think of this work as vital in at least two ways. It gives a situated analysis of state power, and it also shows, either implicitly or not, the constructedness of the nation state itself, which I think is valuable because it sort of gives a really simple narrative, which is that the world was made a certain way, and it can be unmade or remade. So in your own work, how do you figure the state as a particular kind of thing or set of processes? What does it mean for your work to confront the state at a particular moment in time?
I mean, in the Mexican case, I would say it's actually a matter of phantasmagoria. So I think, I don't know, as I was born and raised in Mexico City, and Mexico City as a post-revolutionary state, I would say it's pretty clear to anyone that has spent some time or been in this place, and in Latin America, I would say it's very evident that this is a completely failed state in terms of, I mean, it's fascinating in the sense that we may be pioneers in a post-national construct on how everything will fail. So I would say, or I consider artistic practice to be an incredibly powerful tool to expand these fissures and to question these failures. And I mean, it's something that I think about every day, to be honest, but I still don't have a clear answer to it. So mostly that's one of the points that my practice revolves around. So
thanks so much. I think that idea of expanding the fissures of failure is so evocative and really, I think, connects what the four of you have engaged with today. I think, Livia, you are ready to come in with a point following Joaquín now.
Yes, and I'd like to thank Joaquín, Michael, and Carlos also for the brilliant work presented. And another point which I think cuts across, Astrid, and might challenge a little bit your terminology of a particular moment in time, is what I had seen today across our presentations and across how we are engaging with the ideas of the archive, the statecraft, the rule, the law, the violence. It's also a question of perhaps I think we are seeing how this idea of a particular moment in time might also be in itself a construct. And so far that I think we're all looking at ways in which time is folding, past time is folding onto the present in so heavy ways that they can be felt, they coexist, they exist. So I don't think that any of us is using a particular slice of time or particular place. We are actually activating what we see in our artworks, in our texts, in our research, more in the terms of palimpsests and sort of these overlaying and stratifying of several time frames. I have a saying in my presentation, which was part research, part activation of all these feelings and effects. I have a saying that came to me much later after writing that text that I presented today, which is actually my journaling in the archive. What you have experienced today was actually my a kind of a product of my actual encounters. And this saying is that I had entered the archive, I had started that process of looking for 1968 through the seeking for this image, and I have actually found 2019. So I think the question that you have asked us about this particular moment in time, I think I don't want to dismiss the importance of this, the sort of the laser point that looking at things in a particular moment in time gives us, because it's incredibly relevant. We should be incredibly aware of why we're entering these archives and what we are doing it in this time. I mean, however, I think we're all working our effects and being affected by these processes and by our researches insofar that we can see these actings, this folding actually of the past onto the present. And I think that is something which I see across all the artworks that we have seen today and the ways in which we express our interests. So yeah, I mean, that would be my main addendum, really. For instance, the other thing I could mention is that the text, that journal entry was written in 2019 as I was starting that archival research, and all those encounters happened, and I have been since spoken to some of the the director of the school and the people keeping the archive, and the archive has been repaired so that that very interesting precariousness, which in my writing and in my work I'm taking in as an ontological aspect, is not something that needs fixing or needs repairing or actually needs, it's in itself a way of knowing what was going on at the time, but it has, by the institution, been repaired, it has been sanitized. So if I were to start that process, that research today, I probably would have encountered something much more different than what I had in 2019. Whether less rich or not, I don't know exactly how I would be able to kind of interpret that. So there is something about the particularity of the moments in time and the spatial, you know, and the encounters that we have when we enter these spaces. However, there is a multiplicity, as I said. I wanting to call the attention to this multiplicity of times which have not been resolved, because we have in our epistemic anxieties the sense that time is something that resolves itself and moves on in a linearity, which we all can see it's not the case currently.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Livia. That's such a great, brings such a necessary nuance to the question that I asked. And I think of Carlos's project actually as really kind of highlighting that the continuity of history. In a sense, I think one of the things that's really interesting to me about your work, Carlos, is how you kind of refuse the status of history being conferred to these documents through your reclassification. So to say, like, it cannot be up to these state archives or to the US state itself to sort of name this history and to close this chapter and to, in a sense, mark this kind of period in time as something which is discontinuous with the present and discontinuous with the sort of present administration. And on that note, I believe you're wanting to jump into this conversation now. So please take it away, Carlos.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, in terms of like talking about like a particular moment in time, it's interesting how we're reflecting on these documents that were made, that were produced like several years ago, and they refer to events that happened many years ago, but they still resonate, and not only because the damage they produce, the wound they produce in not only in particular individuals, but in a complete society, are still open. They also resonate with current events, and now we're seeing, like in different countries, you know, we're in the verge of a new fascist area. That what happened in the States with Trump, what happened in Brazil with Bolsonaro, and what is happening right now in Chile with the elections, that a guy who is like the son of a soldier of the Wehrmacht can achieve like the major vote, the major amount of votes in the first round, and how you can explain that turn to the radical right just after we had an incredible uprising like a couple of years ago. And yeah, I mean, history is cyclical, you know, repeats unfortunately, and it seems that no matter what we do, no matter our reflections, we keep making the same mistakes, and I guess that's the importance of like working with these kind of documents in a critical way. That's the importance of reflecting on the different stories that are covered, you know, by the violence, like the violence of the archive, and the work of the artist, I guess, should be committed to those stories, you know, to the other side, to the not official history, and try to discover and try to, in a way, bring back to the surface all the neglected aspects, all the neglected histories of people, you know, who suffer the violence of the state and the violence that is perpetuated in these documents. And I think also reflecting on the archive itself, I think it's really interesting what Joaquín said. This quote, the archive is everywhere. Yeah, because I mean, we work with documents, and that's part of the official archive, but also in our individual or in our own practice, or in like our particular research, as creators or as artists, we are constructing, we're building a new archive. Probably it's a more informal and more like sentimental kind of archive. But still, you know, I guess it's important to incorporate that archive to the critical work or to the challenging of the official one. And maybe I would like to give Michael the opportunity to reflect on this particular kind of archive, and then probably Joaquín, because I'm really interested in this other notion of like the archive is everything or is everywhere.
Yeah, I have something brief and very basic to say about the state, and it's that it seems like the state does activities that we do. You know, they construct narratives, they put on performances, they stage spectacles, and for that reason, I think that artists and writers and critics like us can say things illuminating about the operations of statecraft. It often seems like, as Astrid mentioned in the beginning, that the state is this sort of monolithic thing that is kind of separated from things that we do, but it's actually not the case at all.
The question that Carlos asked of Joaquín, I think, has been sort of echoed in a question from the audience, and I'm really keen to relay this question from the audience. So thank you so much to mine and Livia's colleague Kasia for asking this fantastic question. And perhaps, as Carlos suggested, Joaquín, you can take this up first, since we were kind of heading to you anyway. So Kasia asks, can you talk briefly about what it means to your practice, the physical distance or proximity of the archive? So how does logistics of access impact and inform your work?
I do think it's a very pressing question, and it's very pertinent in the sense that I think each of the circumstances in which these objects exist demand their own condition, and demand whether we are a researcher, whether we are artists, or whether the capacity in which we engage with these epistemic objects that can be activated in very different ways. I don't think there's a single strategy that we can actually adopt into all of these circumstances, in the sense that I do believe that as each of these documents or objects or circumstances have their very own distinctive voice. And I do think our role is to actually decode and manage and create a strategy on how to approach and how to listen to it. And So yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question that this question arises, and of course I do think all of these factors can even intervene on how we end up activating this object in order to shift its sense and create a counter narrative, which is, I think, something that underlies to what has been discussed so far today.
Yeah, I was thinking about the sort of, Michael's point that this documental practice often deals with publicly available archives doesn't necessarily mean that these archives are accessible or legible or coherent or even in any sense kind of readable. I don't think of 20,000 single PDF documents dumped by the US government, mostly redacted, is a particularly readable archive. And I don't think many of us are sort of finding ourselves deep on those websites kind of doing that reading. And so I think this kind of comes back to your idea, Michael, this really interesting idea of this kind of like sort of like homeopathic practice, where it's kind of like the highlighting what is already kind of unreadable or illegible, or kind of, I think, Carlos, you said sort of like how to kind of make evidence from the incoherence of the archive itself is also a really important thing. It's kind of not that these documental practices are trying to make these archives more accessible, but in sort of like engaging with the inaccessibility, it forces us to do that history elsewhere. And that history is being done elsewhere in like lots of different ways and practices. It's sort of like unable to be found in these official sites themselves. I don't know, Michael or Carlos or Livia, if you'd like to take up this point in any way. Yeah, Livia, go for it.
Great question, because I think it also helps us think about some of the urgent matters, which am I here? Yeah, so some of the urgent matters which might or might not just be relevant to Brazil. I bet it isn't. I feel that in 2021, and it's not just now, but in the last few years, we are not just dealing with the destruction of documents itself, but we're just dealing with the destruction of archives. And that goes in two different ways. I can just name a few last occurrences in Brazil: the destruction of the National Museum of Brazil in 2018 by a fire that was absolutely, and there was worldwide consequences. I mean, it's the World Heritage that actually got destroyed, not just Brazilian paperwork. In 2021, the National Film Archives also got destroyed by fire. And in the last couple of days, there has just been announced that Bolsonaro is putting as the head of the National Archives of Brazil someone who has been working as a kind of a national security officer and who has the mandate to recall some of the papers of the legislative, papers that could, for instance, incriminate the executive regarding genocide or other practices of violence. They have the mandate now to recall those papers and destroy them. So we're actually talking about not just the destruction of the infrastructure, but also destruction of the paperwork. And there is another more insidious, perhaps even invisible aspect of archival processes and destruction of archival processes, which talks to Akasha's question about the impossibility of actually being there and seeing it and engaging, which is to do with the digitalization of the paperwork of statecraft, which in itself, I'm not a very particular and not specifically an expert in the subject, but I'm very much aware that historians have been discussing how this is in itself a form of impeding access to archival material, because the digital has its own perishable formatting, but also it can be hidden. It equates with what you're saying about the 2,000, 200,000 word objects, but it has in itself, it's much more susceptible to be hidden. So there is these aspects. I can see that. I almost call them like technological innovations of statecraft violence against memory, against the record, against the things that we hope we could actually work against that grain. And I feel that in reflecting for today's talk, I was actually thinking, well, you have asked us a question about do we work with or against these documentary evidence. So I said, well, we actually, as an urgency of the now, wanting to perhaps even preserve the fact that these documents can still exist so that we can actually work against them whenever we can. So I think that is an urgent question.
Thank you, Carlos. I think you keen to join in.
Yeah, I wanted to add something about the question about the distance or proximity to the archive and how it affects or impact or inform the work. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, for example, in the case of Chile Project, the lack of legibility in a way directed how to respond to, particularly to that type of document. And I think maybe here is key the way we respond to document. Like Susan Briante in her book, Defacing the Monument, said something like, we need to document, but without activism, the document can become a source of nostalgia that is completely useless. And although activism, it seems a quite large and big word for poetry, I think, yeah, it's important to have that in mind, that the way we respond to these documents, and probably addressing some other question by Livia Victor, because we can be in like not on purpose, but according to how we treat or how to respond to these histories or to these documents, we might be contributing or perpetuating the gesture of the perpetrators. But I think here, well, when we are facing this task, try to subvert the intention. It's key. It's crucial, and also maybe with a sense of ethics, always remembering that these stories, they do not belong to us, that we feel like connected to them. They are some part of our history or collective history, but in particular, their histories, their individual histories of other people, and we need to be very careful and respectful of those histories, and try to, you know, represent them or to respond to them in a way that does not perpetuate, you know, the violence that they suffer in the first place. And well, this is probably can arise some other questions and commentaries, but I'm just going to leave it here for the time being.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it reminds me of Livia's question at, you know, at the end of your presentation, how to fight monsters and not become one in the process. So we're a couple of minutes over time, which I'm very happy, because it's such a great conversation. So I'm going to invite Joaquín and then Michael to give some final comments on this, and then we'll end the conversation. So Joaquín, when you're ready.
Thanks, Astrid. I fully agree with Carlos. I mean, to close my participation today, I would only like to stress the significance of performing a counter-narrative operation as a strategy of resisting state violence. I mentioned the Mexican contest briefly. It's fascinating what's going on in here. We have now our own version of post-truth. We call it Otros Datos, which is alternative data courtesy of the individual serving as a president now, in which, I mean, it only adds to this post-national absurdist construct in which the everyday constitutes a recurrent tragedy, although not without dark shades of comedic relief. But I do think it is in our complete power to change that.
Thank you, Michael, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, so I was thinking about these issues of, you know, distance from the archive, and of course, when there's a kind of archontic power that you know, has control over the documents, there is that necessarily that distance, but I was also thinking about distance and proximity to individual documents that can be manipulated by writers and artists such as Joaquín and Carlos. And there's, to me, a kind of radical proximity, and that's something that I really love about their practices, the materiality of working with the text, putting the powder on the text, crossing them out, using objects, the improvised projectiles, and arranging them in ways where it's, despite the distance that we have from official archives, there's that practice that is available. That to me, it's a very intimate practice, and I would probably characterize Joaquín's work and Carlos's work as conceptual in some ways, and oftentimes conceptualism is talked about in, I think that it was Benjamin Buchla that uses that term de-skilling, and it's conceptualism is supposed to be about kind of turning away from the manual kind of virtuosity of using materials, but there's another kind of virtuosity at play that I see again in Joaquín's work and Carlos's work. And to me it's so potent, and there's a kind of ethics that comes out of that very proximate connection with the materiality of the document. So this is all to say that I really appreciate your work, and it was such a just a stimulating time to be in conversation with you all.
Thank you so much. I'm conscious of the time, and so as much as I'd love to keep chatting with everyone, I'm going to call it. I want to thank my amazing presenters today, Livia, Carlos, Michael, and Joaquín. Thank you so much for sharing your research and for being so generous with your ideas and with each other. And thank you also to all of you watching. Thank you for joining the stream. And thank you to the Media Futures Hub for lending us the streaming infrastructure, and also to Andrew, who's been the backroom operator of the stream, comments, etc. So thank you so much. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the year.